In 1903, on the boardwalk of Coney Island, visitors paid 25 cents to watch living premature babies breathe inside glass and steel incubators. Between 1896 and 1943, a showman named Martin County displayed roughly 8,000 infants and claimed to save nearly 6,500 of them, without ever charging a single family. Hospitals dismissed the machines. The public bought tickets. So how did a sideshow attraction become the safest place in America for a 1-pound newborn? That 25-cent admission is the paradox at the heart of this story. It bought a ticket into a building county called the Infantorium, where medicine's most fragile patients were kept alive by carnival money. The babies inside were the smallest human beings anyone had ever seen survive, and the coins funding them came from thrill seekers on their way to the roller coaster. Outside stood the Barkers, whose job was to turn pity into revenue. They shouted a line that became famous along the boardwalk: "Don't pass the babies by." It was a carnival pitch, delivered with the same rhythm used to sell the strong man or the two-headed calf. Except the attraction behind the curtain was a room full of children fighting for breath. County kept that pitch running from 1896 to 1943, nearly half a century of turning survival into spectacle. He was not a doctor by any traceable record, but he understood something the medical establishment did not. If you wanted people to care about premature infants, you first had to make them curious enough to look, and looking cost a quarter. 25 cents in 1903 was no trivial sum. It was roughly the price of 2 loaves of bread, and a laborer earning perhaps $10 a week was handing over a real fraction of a day's pay to file past the glass. The curiosity he exploited had itself been engineered as spectacle. The incubator did not enter the world as a hospital instrument. County claimed to have debuted the machines at the 1896 Berlin Industrial Exposition, and the setting tells you everything. This was an exhibition of progress and marvels, not a ward for the sick. The technology on display in Berlin traced back to France. The machines derived from designs by Stéphane Tarnier and Alexandre Lyon, physicians who had begun to imagine that warmth and controlled air might keep a tiny body alive. Tarnier, an obstetrician at the Paris Maternité Hospital, introduced his first closed incubator there around 1880, and within a few years the mortality rate for the smallest infants in his ward reportedly fell by nearly half. Lyon, working in Nice and then Paris in the 1890s, added a ventilation fan and a thermostat that regulated temperature to within a fraction of a degree, and he opened paying storefront exhibits across Europe to fund his charity cases. Their work gave the incubator its scientific spine, but the idea behind it came from an unlikely place. Tarnier's incubator was inspired by the chicken egg hatchers he saw at the Paris Zoo. He watched machines keep poultry eggs at a steady temperature until they hatched, and he asked a radical question. If warmth could bring a chick to life, why not a premature child? The neonatal ward was born from a barnyard invention. That barnyard lineage explains why respectable medicine wanted nothing to do with it. Established hospitals refused to invest in premature care, and their refusal left the field wide open for showmen. A machine born at a zoo and displayed at an exposition simply did not look like medicine to the men who ran the great hospitals of the era. Behind that refusal sat a colder judgment. Premature infants were often labeled weaklings, children too poorly made to be worth saving. The prevailing wisdom held that nature had already decided their fate, and that spending resources on them was sentiment wasted on the doomed. A 1-pound baby was not a patient. It was a statistic waiting to happen. In this period, the ideas of the eugenics movement were spreading through respectable medicine, and figures who preached the survival of the fittest saw little reason to intervene for infants born, as they put it, unfit. Because of that judgment, Most hospitals in the United States had no premature care units before the 1940s. There was nowhere to send these children and no protocol when they arrived. A birth that came too early was treated as a private tragedy, not a medical problem, and the machinery to solve it sat instead on a boardwalk collecting coins. So the families were told the cruelest thing a parent can hear. There was nothing to be done. Take the child home, keep it warm, and prepare for the worst. Into that silence stepped a showman with a building full of incubators and a promise the doctors would not make. He said the babies could live. County carried that promise across the Atlantic and reinvented himself as an American attraction. In 1901, he staged his babies at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, where the incubator concession became one more marvel of the new century. That same Buffalo Fair became infamous weeks later, when President William McKinley was shot on its grounds in September 1901, and the exposition's grand electric spectacle shared a boardwalk with County's rows of glass cases. He arrived as a European man of science, a persona he wore as easily as the machines he operated. How much of that persona was true remains genuinely unclear. County's real identity and medical credentials remain disputed to this day. Historians have chased his name, his training, and his diplomas, and much of the trail dissolves into invention. Some researchers, including the journalist Dawn Raffel, who spent years reconstructing his life, concluded he may have been born Michael Cohn in Krotozin, in what was then Prussian Poland, around 1869, and that his claim to have studied under the pioneering pediatrician Pierre Boudin was likely fabricated. What is certain is that his exhibits appeared at World's Fairs across decades, and that the results were real, even when the biography was not. That gap between the showman's story and his results is where things get strange. Because behind the ticket booth, past the barker and the paying crowd, ran a medical operation that was genuinely rigorous. The theater out front was a lie in service of a truth in back. The care was real. That care depended on the women who fed the babies. Trained wet nurses were required to follow strict diets and were forbidden from smoking, rules enforced to protect the quality of their milk. County treated these women as clinical staff, not carnival help, and he policed their habits with a discipline the crowds never saw. He is said to have once dismissed a wet nurse on the spot for sneaking a hot dog and beer on the boardwalk, insisting that what she ate passed directly to the infants in her care. One nurse anchored the whole enterprise. Louise Recht worked with County for decades, moving from fair to fair, tending the incubators through the long hours after the crowds went home. She was the continuity behind the shifting exhibits, understanding these infants better than most physicians of her time ever bothered to. Under her watch, the feeding was clinical and exact. Babies were fed by tube and by breast milk on strict schedules, measured and timed the way a modern nursery would recognize instantly. The incubators themselves were tall steel and glass boxes, each fed warm air through a coiled pipe heated by a boiler, with a thermometer mounted inside so an attendant could read the temperature at a glance and hold it near 96 degrees. Nothing was improvised for the show. The performance stopped at the glass, and behind it the work was as careful as any hospital ward that would not exist for decades. That work drew crowds that dwarfed anything a hospital could have imagined. The exhibits turned survival itself into a public performance, and the public came in numbers hard to grasp. The peak arrived in Chicago, where the 1933 and 1934 Century of Progress exhibit became one of the fair's top draws. Over the fair's 2 seasons, more than 48 million people passed through the gates, and County's Incubator building competed directly for their attention with the Skyride Towers and Sally Rand's Fan Dance a short walk away. Across all the decades and fairs, millions of visitors viewed the Incubator babies. They lined up, paid their quarters, and filed past the rows of glass cases the way they might pass paintings in a gallery. Except these frames held breathing children, and the visitors knew some of them might not survive the season. To make the miracle legible, the nurses staged small demonstrations. They would show how a wedding ring could slide over an infant's arm, past the wrist, because the limb was thinner than a woman's finger. It was theatrical, and it worked. In an instant, the crowd understood exactly how impossible this child's survival should have been. The most personal proof lived inside County's own family. One of his patients was his premature daughter, Hildegard. Born in 1907, weeks too early, she was placed in the very machines her father displayed, treated as one more fragile case in the row of glass cases. Hildegard did not merely survive. She grew up and became a nurse at the exhibits, tending the babies who had come after her. The child saved by the show returned to run it, living evidence that the incubator worked, standing right there beside the machine that had kept her breathing. She lived a full adult life, and her survival gave County the one credential no diploma could match. Whatever the disputes about his past, he could point to his own daughter and say the method was sound. His family was proof, and proof was the only argument the doctors could not wave away. But mixing infants with amusement parks carried a danger proof could not fix. In 1911, a fire tore through Dreamland at Coney Island and destroyed much of the park. The blaze broke out before dawn on May 27, 1911, when a bucket of hot tar ignited inside the Hell Gate attraction, and within hours the flames had consumed the entire park at a loss estimated at several $1 million. The disaster exposed exactly what was wrong with keeping the most vulnerable patients inside a wonderland built for cheap thrills and flammable spectacle. Amid the chaos, the incubator babies were reportedly carried to safety. Nurses and staff pulled the infants from their machines and out through the smoke, and by surviving accounts, the children lived. But the near miss was total. A single spark had come close to killing the very babies the exhibit existed to save. The fire began near the park's rides and amusements that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with the crowds. That was the whole tension of County's enterprise laid bare in flame. The children needed the crowd's money, and the crowd came for a fairground that could burn to the ground in an afternoon. Even without the fire, plenty of people thought the whole arrangement indefensible. Critics condemned the displays as exploitation, the profit of sick children dressed up as charity. Some doctors called the exhibits an undignified spectacle, beneath the seriousness of medicine and cruel to the families involved. Their complaint was not baseless. The public did pay to gawk at struggling newborns, and there is no polished way to describe the transaction. People bought tickets to watch children who might die, and the sight of a 1-pound baby was sold alongside the sword swallower and the fat lady. The dignity of the patient was the price of admission. County answered the critics with a single line he never abandoned. He insisted the admission fees funded free care, that not one family ever paid, and that the coins from curious strangers bought the milk, the machines, and the nurses' wages. The gawkers, he argued, were paying for a service no hospital would provide. Judge the spectacle however you like, he said, but the babies lived. That argument reached its grandest stage at the 1939 New York World's Fair. The fair, built in Flushing Meadows around its Trilon and Perisphere, hosted a major incubator exhibit, the peak of everything County had built across 4 decades. It was also, though few could see it yet, the beginning of the end. The end announced itself quietly through the turnstiles. Attendance and revenue began declining as the novelty faded. The public had seen incubator babies at fair after fair for a generation, and a marvel repeated long enough stops being a marvel. What had once stopped crowds cold now competed for their attention like any other booth. And there were plenty of booths competing. Rival attractions crowded the same audience, offering newer thrills and stranger sights. The Incubator show had been a sensation because nothing else was like it, and now the world had caught up. The very familiarity County had spent decades building was quietly starving his exhibit of the coins it depended on. The deeper reason the show was ending had nothing to do with rivals. County's methods had finally proven themselves. The results he had displayed for 40 years were undeniable, and the medical establishment could no longer pretend the machines were carnival junk. The hospitals adopted the very technology they had scorned. The turning point came in the same year as that final great fair. Cornell's New York hospital opened a premature station in 1939, a proper clinical unit for exactly the infants County had been saving on the boardwalk. The unit was led by Dr. Julius Hess of Chicago, often called the father of American neonatology, who had corresponded with County for years and openly borrowed from his practices. Medicine had at last built the ward it should have built decades earlier, on the model the showman had been running all along. County understood what that meant for him, and he seemed to welcome it. He reportedly said his life's work was done once the hospitals took over. He had never wanted to run a permanent institution. He had wanted to prove a point, and the moment respectable medicine embraced the incubator, the point was won, and the show had no reason to exist. Medical acceptance simply ended the need for public exhibits. Once a mother could bring her premature child to a hospital and expect it to be cared for, there was no reason to send her to a fairground. The very success of the mission dissolved the machinery that had carried it. County had made himself obsolete on purpose, so he brought the curtain down. County closed the Coney Island exhibit in 1943, ending nearly half a century of displaying babies to paying crowds. The barkers fell silent, the glass cases went dark, and the man who had shouted, "Don't pass the babies by," walked away from the only enterprise he had ever run. He did not walk away rich. County died in 1950 in relative obscurity, nearly broke, remembered by few, and honored by fewer. The man who claimed to have saved thousands of children spent his last years largely forgotten, a faded carnival name in a country that had moved on to real hospitals and real neonatal wards. His poverty makes sense only when you remember his one unbending rule. He never charged the families of the babies he treated. Every cent of care came from the ticket buyers, never from the parents, so a lifetime of saving children left him with almost nothing to show. The showman who trafficked in coins kept none for the families who mattered. Decades after the shows ended, the children he saved began finding one another. Surviving incubator babies held reunions in later life, grown men and women gathering to trade a single strange fact about themselves. They had each begun life as a boardwalk attraction, watched by strangers who paid a quarter to see them breathe. Their very existence backed up the number County had always cited. He claimed a survival rate around 85%, extraordinary for infants everyone else had written off as doomed. The reunions were the living arithmetic of that claim, room after room of adults who statistically should never have grown up at all. And they did not just grow up. Many lived into their 80s and beyond, carrying full, ordinary lives through a full century. Careers, marriages, children, grandchildren, all flowing from a machine at a fairground and a showman with a disputed name. The sideshow had produced not a moment of survival, but entire long lifetimes. That is the uncomfortable truth this story leaves behind. Entertainment paid for a medical revolution. Ticket revenue funded free neonatal care for thousands of children at a time when the medical world refused to lift a finger. And the coins of the curious did what the wisdom of physicians would not. Those fairground incubators were not a dead end. Modern neonatal intensive care units trace their lineage directly back to them, to the machines Tarnier borrowed from a zoo and County planted on a boardwalk. Every glowing incubator in every hospital nursery today is a descendant of that quarter-a-look spectacle, and County himself has finally been given his due. The man who died, broke and forgotten, is now credited as a pioneer of neonatology, the field that grew from his stubborn boardwalk experiment. History has done what his own era refused to do. It has called him a doctor of the smallest patients, whatever his diploma did or did not say. Sideshow, spectacala, that saved thousands. That is the contradiction, and it never resolves neatly. A carnival barker, a disputed identity, and a paying crowd of gawkers together kept alive children that medicine had already buried in its imagination, and the lives they built afterward were as real as any. If this forgotten piece of history moved you, consider following along for more stories that textbooks left out.